Welcome to the In Conversation series with Housing Options Scotland and the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, with your hosts Pedro Cameron and Dr. Gareth Young. This series explores equality, diversity and inclusion in housing research and practice through sharing stories and experiences from people working across the housing sector. In this episode, we talk to Janice Stevenson. Janice is a Development Officer at LGBT Youth Scotland. LGBT Youth Scotland are a youth work service providing youth groups for LGBT young people across Scotland. Janice's work focuses on influencing policy in Scotland for LGBT youth populations. In this discussion, we discuss discrimination in housing for LGBT people, challenges with people not recognising their own rights to housing, and issues with gatekeeping and accessing services. We explore research and data in this area, and the conversation raises issues that we know many organisations face, which is a lack of data to help providers deliver appropriate services. Just to start with, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yes, no problem at all. So I am Janice Stevenson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a Development Officer at LGBT Youth Scotland. So we're not a housing and homelessness service. We are a youth work service, so we provide youth groups right across Scotland, digital and face-to-face. That's our sort of bread and butter. I sit within our national programmes team, and that's much more the sort of policy, public affairs, policy influencing side of things. So my job generally centres around gender-based violence and particularly domestic abuse, but obviously there are links there to housing and homelessness. So I do lots of work with young people participation work, and that included our Youth Commission on Housing and Homelessness, which we ran from 2016 to 2020. Now we have Voices Unheard, who are looking more at kind of domestic abuse and healthy relationships. I also do lots of work with the gender-based violence sector and related services, so that might be criminal justice, health, housing, basically anyone who would come into contact with a domestic abuse survivor. So that might be some policy support, it can be delivering training, awareness raising work, or just supporting them to improve sort of practice and visibility within their services to make them more inclusive and better able to respond to LGBT people.
So what part of the aim of what we wanted to do with this In Conversation series was to start opening up the discussions around the different ways that certain people might be excluded from housing or face particular barriers into sort of secure housing, safe housing, and sort of thinking about that idea of choice for certain groups and do they have it, and that sort of thing. Recognising that there's lots of different issues for different sort of groups, and it's not a one size fits all. So just from your own perspective and the work that you've done, what would you say are some of sort of the main contemporary issues at the moment?
I guess there's lots and lots going on in the kind of world of homelessness in Scotland. We've seen huge changes over the last few years, even in light of COVID and in spite of COVID. But I guess particularly for LGBT people, big issues are just marginalised groups on the whole and more likely to experience homelessness, whether that's because of the prejudice and discrimination that they face, exclusion from families, particularly for LGBT people coming out. There are a whole myriad of reasons as to why marginalised groups tend to have higher experiences of homelessness or repeat homelessness. Poverty is a big one. Marginalised groups experience that prejudice, discrimination. You might be excluded from the labour market or just find it a bit more difficult. So poverty can go hand in hand, and well, we know that that's a massive issue in terms of accessing housing and maintaining that housing security. We also know that just prejudice on the whole, landlords might just not like you because you're a particular group. Maybe more so that we would see that in the private sector and private rents and things than, well, I would like to think we'd see it less within the public sector and social landlords. And I guess also just a lack of awareness of housing rights. People don't recognise themselves as being homeless it's unless you're ruthless, I guess. So for a young person who's sofa surfing, feels quite secure, they've got a couple of mates that'll give them a safe space to sleep a few nights a week, and they can move around. They don't really recognise themselves as being homeless. So even just that recognition is really needed in order to say, right, okay, now I deserve support and I want to access support. So there's big issues there. And then just generally service providers, a lot of gatekeeping goes on. Resources are tight. The threshold at which you get support or don't get support can vary depending on literally your postcode, where you're at, which local authority you're in, what housing stock is available, and just generally, I guess, for young people, ideas that they maybe should go back home, and shouldn't be out of the house at 16, 17, 18. So a lot of things can go on there where, I guess gatekeeping of just expecting that young people can repair broken family relationships, which might well be the case and can be fantastic for preventing homelessness. But if that young person's experienced prejudice, discrimination, is being abused by family members, those that they live with, just because they're LGBT, we certainly shouldn't be returning them to that situation. So there's lots of things. I could talk all day about some of the issues.
No, that's great. And I think we'll pick up on some of that, especially that, because I think the gatekeeping idea is really interesting. We do talk a little bit about the work that housing providers and service providers are doing a bit later on. So I think we'll really unpick some of that. I know you've talked a little bit about the work that you're doing with LGBT Youth Scotland, but it was just to unpick that a little bit more, so if you're happy, just talk through some of the key things that you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, so we developed the Youth Commission on Housing and Homelessness back in 2016, and it was really in recognition that for a number of years we had delivered Voices Unheard with that focus on domestic abuse, healthy relationships, and a key factor that just kept coming up was homelessness, whether there was links there to sexual exploitation, to young people experiencing abuse at home, young people experiencing abuse in their own families, or young people witnessing domestic abuse within their family home and feeling the need to escape, often ending up homeless. So we decided that actually this needed a particular focus, and we did. At the beginning, we set out to do 1 year, and it became very quickly apparent within that first year that this was quite a big issue, and it was going to require a lot more focus. So we did get additional funding, and we made it a 4-year-long project. So that basically involved bringing together a whole host of LGBT young people from across Scotland. They were all aged 16 to 25, and I worked consistently with them. But when we first started, we didn't know a lot about the housing sector, about homelessness. It wasn't really a sector LGBT Youth Scotland had been hugely involved in before. So we really were starting at the bottom and decided to do research. And it was one of the best things we did. And the young folk were amazing because they weren't just interested in what's going on for young people. They also wanted to know what's happening for professionals. What are the barriers they face to be able to include us? What's actually going on in policy, what's missing there that makes these services, basically that allows the gaps that we fall through. They were a great wee bunch. So we did do some research with LGBT young people. That was quite a big consultation. It was over 100 responses. We also did some work with frontline service providers, a bit of a group consultation focus group. And we sent a survey around all the local authorities, which we got half of them responded, 16. And effectively what we discovered was in Scotland, nobody's got a clue how many LGBT young homeless people there are, because it's not routinely recorded and it's not monitored. It's not something that has to be reported on. So quite often service providers are completely unaware that the young person in front of them is LGBT. And the young people themselves very much feeling, actually, I wouldn't want to go to a service, going to the council, where it's very much their experiences were often the one-stop shop idea, turning up, half my community sitting on a chair, take your ticket, wait your turn. How do you go up there and say, actually, yeah, my parents are really homophobic and I need to get out of that house, and out yourself to half the community? There was just so many things. We know that we struggled to find research in Scotland, but Albert Kennedy Trust, who are an LGBT youth homelessness charity operating across the UK, but they provide direct services in England, they identified that around a quarter, just less than a quarter of young homeless people identify as LGBT, which is massively disproportionate to the wider population. But what I always found interesting about their research was that about 3/4 of those young people felt that being LGBT was a causal factor in their homelessness. So we often will think about youth homelessness in terms of breakdown of family relationship, and quite often it's young people that kind of shoulder the blame for that. It's their difficult behaviour because they're teenagers and or young emerging adults, and that causes conflict within families. So quite often young people get the blame, if you like, for the breakdown in relationships. But actually what we see for LGBT young people is quite often it is either a fear of coming out at home, having to live a life that isn't your own, feeling inauthentic in some way, and really, I need to get out because I'm not safe to be out as an LGBT person at home. Or it might be that they've came out and they've had those really negative reactions. And we see that a lot, particularly for trans young people, if they want to transition. So changes to name, pronoun, how they want to dress and present themselves can be very much met with a lot of transphobic abuse and coercion and control from the wider family or community, in fact. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why they become homeless in the first place that are quite different to their non-LGBT peers. But unfortunately, they're really hidden because, like I said, services just don't record, don't ask about that routinely, and it's not something that's done routinely. We are seeing that improving over time. Services are becoming a bit more aware of why that's important and how to do it effectively, but it's still not something that's done everywhere. So again, postcode lottery. We also found that in our work with service providers, we generally found that they did not have the confidence to respond to LGBT young people. So certainly from our frontline practitioners, all but 2 people, and that was 24 professionals, all but 2 rated their confidence to support a young person as low or very low. For the 2 who rated it quite high, both had received specific training on LGBT experiences from ourselves. So that's me patting back to us, well done. But yeah, it's just that it really highlighted that need for real training, and not people said, we get equality and diversity training, but it's very much the how do you meet the bare minimum of the law, often e-learning tools. They're not very practice-based, they're just quite, here is the law, don't be bad to people, click next. It's a lot of reading, and it's just not very, people just don't find it effective, I guess. So yeah, getting that really good interactive training that's based on lived experience was a real big benefit for people. We also noted that a lot of our local authorities who responded, only about half delivered training on LGBT identities at all. And yeah, rarely was there anything about kind of domestic abuse or familial abuse, prejudice-based abuse, and how that links out with women's experiences in terms of violence against women, or men's violence against women. So very heteronormative stuff around domestic abuse, not often including LGBT experiences. So yeah, lots of key issues for LGBT people across the board that we sort of uncovered.
Wow, yeah, well, there's a lot. It seems like it's good that it's heartening to see that those are being identified, I suppose, by an organisation like yourselves. I wonder if you could give any examples. You talked a bit about how things are getting better sometimes, or a little bit better in some cases, and I wondered if you could give me any examples of any good work that either local authorities or housing providers that you're aware of are doing to sort of improve things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't speak necessarily specifically about particular local authorities or housing providers, but on the whole, generally we've seen, prior to setting up the Youth Commission on housing and homelessness, we had very little engagement from housing service providers. And once we started talking about the issue and young people were really at the forefront of that, it made people sit up. So we certainly saw a big influx in organisations seeking training from us over that sort of period of time, looking for training, looking for some policy advice and guidance. And as an organisation, we were invited to represent young people and speak to their experiences at a number of sort of key strategic groups. So that included like the homelessness prevention strategy group set up by Scottish Government and Away Home Scotland's coalition to end youth homelessness. We do see the simplest of tweaks can make the biggest difference. Sometimes people get a bit, equality and diversity, it's so big, there's so much to know. But actually it can be such just small changes to practice can make such a huge difference. So we have seen a lot of services just becoming more visibly inclusive, making those bold statements of we include people of all sexual orientations, gender identities, race, ethnicity, being explicit in it, and rather than just saying we are open to all people. Because that doesn't speak to marginalised groups. They often feel, well, do you mean me? So some of the things that we've seen people do is just that very clear, visible inclusion, getting involved with the LGBT community, whether it's attending sort of pride events, marking commemorative days, just raising awareness of LGBT experiences. And we see people doing that quite creative ways, whether it's kind of blog posts, social media campaigns, all sorts of things. What else have people been doing? Getting training, like I said, has been a big one. And we actually worked, the young people within the Youth Commission developed a training package for housing providers that we ran for that 4 years. And it was really well received. We also see just general inclusion of LGBT voices a bit more within the homelessness sector. We, just things like there was a youth homelessness prevention pathway developed. We were involved in that, so just ensuring that there's that very specific information about LGBT experiences and how service providers can respond. So there's a bit going on at policy level, but that service delivery just being really clear of how we do things. And then we've had lots of kind of registered social landlords, housing associations and things that have worked towards the LGBT charter mark. And I don't know if you know much about the charter, but it's effectively a set of standards that any organisation or school can work towards across their sort of leadership, training, policy, practice, visibility and equalities monitoring, diversity, that sort of stuff. And once you meet a certain amount of standard, or once you can evidence that you meet a certain standard, then people can get an award at bronze, silver, gold or a foundations level. And we've seen a lot more housing associations doing that. And it's a great way for services to really embed inclusion. And we often get reports, so it's not just about LGBT inclusion, it helps them think about all equality and diversity and how to sort of embed that as a whole organisation response. We do see other bits and bobs. We've seen services trying to set up like specific LGBT groups or looking at specific LGBT projects. But then COVID happened and a lot of stuff and we had a lot of organisations who had a lot of ideas and ambitions to really try something new for LGBT people. But then COVID kind of put a kibosh on it. So we'll see, hopefully, as we recover, some of those organisations will pick that work back up again. And certainly if they're out there, I'd be happy to have chats with them. But yeah, so there is lots and lots going on. It just needs to be a bit more standardised approach. Making sure everybody gets the same and less of a postcode lottery would be great.
So yeah, I think you've kind of answered our next question about, do you think enough support is given to the workforce within organisations to ensure inclusion? But these are the kind of things that you've been talking about there.
Yeah, certainly within some organisations, brilliant. I would say that there's maybe other organisations who are doing bits and bobs of work that I'm not aware of, everything that goes on in Scotland. But yeah, we've seen organisations who have perhaps employed an LGBT champion where they get a good bit of training and help other staff to just, as that sounding board, that point of contact. That can be great. But what happens when that person's on holiday or off sick and an LGBT person comes in the door and you're not sure how to respond? So really getting that whole organisation response is really key. But yeah, in terms of support for staff, we generally, all we ever get is we need more training, and we need specific training, and that training should be based on actual lived experience, not just about what is a lesbian, how do I address a lesbian. The key, fundamental, it needs to be really understanding what are these people's experiences, what are the barriers, and what can I do, I do as a professional or a service provider to make that journey easier and to give people better outcomes overall.
Totally, that's great. So sticking with the idea of the workforce, the other sort of thing we were thinking about as well, and just your views and observations from service providers that you work with, so whether that be housing or other services, is, do you think organisations are actually doing enough to ensure that their staff teams are representative? Back to the points I think you were making at the start around gatekeeping and things, people are constantly presenting but not ever seeing themselves in these spaces. It must be harder again. So yeah, it was just, from the work that you've been doing, whether you've sort of seen anything changing in that space.
I'm not really sure I can answer that. Obviously, I don't know much about everybody's equality and diversity monitoring in their organisations, but I would certainly argue that there is a real need for representation. And I think we can all try and do that, and it can become a bit of a tokenistic exercise. And we should absolutely be doing, avoid the tokenism, because it's not helpful for anybody. Having real meaningful moves to make our organisations more diverse is much more important, even if that's at a slightly slower pace, I guess. But yeah, getting it right. And I often find sometimes people come to me who are maybe the LGBT staff member, that I'm the voice of the community, and staff within marginalised groups or protected groups can end up feeling like they have to be the voice for their whole community. So yeah, I think that representation is massively important, should not be undervalued, but it needs to be meaningful. It needs to be meaningful. But actually, I think consultation with the people who are affected by whatever issue we're working on, whether it's homelessness or anything else, actually hearing those lived experience voices. I often say I've worked with professionals who have told me, I don't think that this is too much of an issue, and I'm a gay man, and I'm like, yeah, but you're also in your 40s, you're highly educated because you weren't out when you were at uni, you're blah blah, all these privileges that have came with your life aren't perhaps the same as the non-binary trans young person who's been booted out of home at 16. And yeah, you maybe can't speak to their experiences. I can't speak to their experiences. So I think, representation across boards within staff teams, that being celebrated, hugely important, but the actual voices of lived experience are that needs to be more embedded to services, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Yeah, just want to avoid the you're the token person that we go to.
Do you think, this is kind of an extra question, but do you think sort of by virtue of, particularly with homelessness teams, I'm thinking about in terms of local authorities, do you think by virtue of the teams getting younger, there's probably going to be a sort of automatic lean that way, like in terms of, or at least in terms of social awareness, or?
I hope so. I think it's, I certainly wouldn't want to say, just because we have a younger workforce, that automatically means that they're more enlightened people. I think that discredits a lot of our older people that are doing amazing stuff. I think generally speaking, we have a population just now of young people who are much more socially aware than any generation that came before them. Whilst the internet has its flaws, it also has some huge benefits on that front. And young people are, I feel, generally a bit more aware of their rights, aware of the rights of others, and just a little more outwardly and loudly committed to social justice and inclusion. There's a real strong voice amongst young people. So I would like to think that that will filter that general awareness of people's identities and issues, but will filter in gradually. But I think there also needs to be that push from the top down also, rather than waiting for organic change. But yeah, our policies, our strategies, local authorities rarely have anything LGBT specific in their homeless strategies. We reviewed them back in 2018 and none of them, not one, mentioned LGBT identity. So yeah, there needs to be that high level as well as that cultural change.
Yeah.
I think cultural change will eventually lead into the high level change, and I want the big stuff to change quicker than it does.
Totally. Which kind of brings us on to sort of like, how do you think EDI in general, or could be improved at a legislative level rather than like on a local government level? Or
yeah, I would definitely say that there is, one of the biggest things is an absolute need to have standardised, reportable equalities monitoring across all the protected characteristics or protected groups. At the moment, housing and homelessness tend to report on issues around ethnicity and disability, but other groups not so much. So I think having legislation in place and an expectation at government level that this will be reportable puts the onus then on local authorities to improve the paperwork and the procedures, how that's recorded, and what they actually do with that information. Because at the moment they really don't know automatically who they're working with, or what barriers those people might experience. And that translates into a lot of things. We generally find that actually for service providers not knowing a lot could be quite negatively impactful for young people. So yeah, it's essential that we have that standard monitoring, and that I guess that in turn would mean staff would automatically hopefully get some training on how to ask those questions appropriately, how to work with these protected groups. So yeah, I think that one's big and key, is that Scottish Government demand that information to say we want to see it so we can record it and review it, and actually monitor how are we performing across individual smaller protected populations rather than the mainstream, because the mainstream often, those stats swallow up the other experiences. So that's massively important. I think another area that's really missing in Scotland is recognition of familial abuse. So in England and Wales, across the rest of the UK, domestic abuse is defined as basically domestic, meaning family or within the home. So that would include parents, siblings, aunties, uncles, so on and so forth. In Scotland, domestic abuse is defined specifically around partner or ex-partner abuse, which is great for responding to that intimate partner sort of stuff, but it does leave a huge gap. Now, yes, there's legislation. If a young person is experiencing physical violence at home, if they're being locked in the house, then there's criminal law that can deal with that. But we know that young people are unlikely to pick up the phone and report their parents for kidnapping them, or report their parents for being verbally abusive and using homophobic, biphobic, transphobic slurs, and that sort of stuff. So there's a really big gap there in terms of our knowledge of what impact does that have, but even in support situations. So down south, if you're a young person and that's going on, there is a support service there that you can access. North of the border, it just doesn't exist. So kind of out with child protection or vulnerable adult protection, there's not very much that we can do to safeguard a young person or any person experiencing domestic abuse within a family setting, that familial sort of abuse. And we know that that's really high for LGBT young people in particular. Yeah. So I think there needs to be, that's my two big things, is the qualities monitoring, and not just doing it tokenistically, but actually reviewing, are outcomes the same for LGBT groups as non-LGBT groups? If they're not, why not? Is there prejudice and discrimination going on within services? Is there barriers we're not aware of? How do we address that? Use the research and using the information is, I guess, just as important as gathering it. So that, and making sure that there is some recognition of familial abuse, and the impact that that has would be my big golden tickets.
Brilliant. That's so interesting. That's not something I knew about. The familial abuse thing. That's really interesting.
Yeah, there is some sort of service provision things around honour-based violence, which was very much about when shame comes into it, you're shaming the family, you're dishonouring the family in some way. But that's predominantly only recognised, like the vast majority of people would only recognise that within Black minority ethnic communities. It's very much seen as a BME issue, but actually your white, Scottish, Christian, secular, whatever person, that level of you're bringing shame on the family. We're a working class family, the community will be disgusted. Your dad can't show his face in the local pub. That element of shame, it could kind of meet the threshold for honour-based violence too. But it's just not widely recognised or known.
And then just to sort of finish off, we've got just a few questions around research, because what we're doing, we come from two different organisations, so I can come from a research background as well. And what we're trying to do is encourage and kind of have that platform for more research in this space, and just to understand how research is used or could be improved. So I know we've touched on some of this, the existing research, but it was just whether there's any work that you know of taking place, or any good work at the moment happening.
I'm not sure of anything that's going on currently. Again, just because the Youth Commission kind of ended in 2020, so we've not had as much of a focus on housing and homelessness the last couple of years. But I am aware of some, like we've had the Centre for Homelessness Impact down south just released a report highlighting some of the research gaps, if you like, for LGBT experiences. So I'd recommend giving that a good read. I do think that there needs to be more research done, but I also think that actually there's a lot of research that already goes on, and if we could just add demographic information into that and capture who is LGBT, who are the BME people, and then analyse those responses in addition to that, collective everybody's experience, it might highlight some issues. So it's not necessarily about doing hundreds of other additional research. Sometimes it's just making the tiniest tweaks to what we're already doing to make sure we can capture those marginalised experiences as well. So that can be, a really quick and easy fix for anybody that's about to launch any research. Get your demographics in there. I would also say that there's some definite areas that I would like to see research done in. We touched on some of the links between domestic abuse, familial abuse, and LGBT experiences of homelessness, but I think that needs a much stronger focus, and not just me and a bunch of young people running around the country asking lots of questions, and something a bit more research focused. Academic research would be great. What else was I going to recommend? Generally, the Centre for Homelessness Impact, they recommended research on understanding how to reduce prejudice and discrimination amongst professionals. And that was a light bulb moment for me when I seen it. We've done, and lots of people have done, questions about, well, what are the barriers? We've got a lot of understanding of what are the barriers, or what providers should do to fix those barriers or address those barriers. But actually, it's that mindset and the culture and the values that people hold and bring into our institutions. So definitely, I think I would back that one up, that we need some research in that area of how is prejudice and discrimination? What are the biases that people are holding, and how is it impacting their practice? Would be good. And generally, I would like to see better monitoring of the impact of different interventions. Again, including that demographic information rather than just, 90% of people thought that it was brilliant and it really worked well for them. But if you look at that information, and that 90% are all heterosexual cisgender people, and the 10% that it didn't work for are LGBT or Black minority, whichever group, it definitely tells you a story that it's working for that group, but it's not working here. What's going on? So I would argue that's needed too.
It's sort of just like, it's about embedding it into everything, isn't it?
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be difficult. Doesn't need to be a huge arduous process of dismantling your entire way of working and putting it back together. Just generally those really small tweaks to how you do it. And what I guess for me, one of the biggest barriers that professionals bring to me is a fear of getting it wrong. It seems to be the hugest hurdle. And rather than say, okay, I'm not very sure of this person's identity or the language they're using, I can ask about that. People get the fear that if they ask, they will look discriminatory or look prejudiced. But actually what happens is then as a professional, you're just kind of sitting avoiding the elephant in the room, looking really awkward. And that person isn't sitting there thinking, I wonder if you're just a bit worried that you might get it wrong. It makes you feel like, why are you treating me this way? You're looking at me funny. Is it because of my identity? So I always say my biggest top tip to any professional out there is, if you don't know, just ask. If someone uses language you're not sure of, just tell them, I've not heard that language before. Can you explain what that means? What pronoun would you like to be known as? What name do you want me to use? Just simple questions. It's absolutely fine to ask questions, respectfully, of course.
Just a last one from me, which is just back to some of the research side of things, really. But we talked about the need for more research, more academic research, and that's what we're trying to encourage as well. One of the things that we're always thinking about is, we'll go away, we'll do the research, we'll write the reports, we'll do the journal articles that will, kind of go into those repositories, which are now becoming more accessible, but we're still conscious that these are quite long documents, and so how can we make sure that research is user-friendly? And that's for policymakers, for practitioners, who obviously the more conversations we're having like this, we're realising how busy they are, and they're actually just needing information to be accessible, and we just want to make sure that we provide that, really. So just thoughts on what you would like to see, or people around you in your networks would welcome.
I think I absolutely agree that we can put a lot of effort into research that then barely gets read. People read the key highlights and the conclusion and skip the middle. And unfortunately, the middle's where a lot of the understanding is. The facts are great, but it's that lived experience and how that plays out in people's lives, understanding. That's the important bit that people need to understand. I'm always a bit wary myself of putting out large, chunky reports. I do find that actually we can be super creative in how we put things out. You can do a massive piece of research and then release things very thematically, infographics, short, snappy, pop up. There it is. It's easy to use. So creativity is definitely key. And again, I will advocate my entire life that having real lived experience there in the room involved in that is key. We got quite creative with the results of the Youth Commission on Housing and Homelessness findings in delivering an art exhibition. So they created a single art piece for each of the key statistics and then invited decision makers along. Key professionals, key services to raise that awareness. But we also asked them there and then to make a commitment of what change they were going to do and then following that up. So, it was great. We could have sent them a report. Would they have read it? No. Would they maybe have done something about it? Maybe not. But actually getting them in the room with LGBT young people to hear directly from them, to look at this impactful artwork and to get them to make that declaration of, here's what change I'm going to make, was really helpful. So I often say research is often something that we do to people and then we just kind of throw at people. And actually we should be doing more of doing it with people and then helping those who need that research to shape, actually giving them clear recommendations on how to, is often really useful. Distilling your research down into 10 top tips. I love me some top tips, so I do.
Really
short, succinct, straight to the point. And if something sticks with you, go, I'm interested in that. It makes you think, okay, I'm going to go and look at least that bit of a larger report. So yeah, I think things need to be accessible, clear, avoid the jargon, plain English. If there's lots of, it might be about homelessness, but that could be relevant to the domestic abuse sector, to the care sector, so many other sectors that intersect it. So yeah, avoid the sectoral jargon and make it things accessible to everybody so we understand. I think any other top tips for making research work? Yeah, I just think having actual real people involved in the research is big. And I would say not just as participants, but as in terms of shaping the research, designing the researge.
Yeah, that's and yeah, another little question actually, if I can, just on that point, because I think so. I generalise, and there's loads of good work happening in academia as well as in policy and practice, but just reflecting on the work that maybe has come through our centre and our researchers, and I've noticed that we aren't the most diverse bunch, and that is sort of systemic within the sector. And I, just from conversations I've been having with other researchers, get a sense that there's a little fear, if you've not lived the experience, are you the right person to then take that research on? And my worry is that people might not dare step up to it to make the change if they don't fit. And I think the point you made as well is really good around, I'm a gay man, but I grew up where, my parents worked through me coming out to them relatively quickly. I'd maintain the house, all that sort of thing. My experience is so far apart from a lot of the people you'll be working with experience. I might then not feel confident or comfortable taking that on, yet these are issues that we really need to research. So, we're trying to inspire our future researchers as well to sort of to pick up, these topics and do this really important research. So just any thoughts or advice you give to researchers who maybe don't feel comfortable doing that because they haven't had that lived experience, what would you say to them to try and encourage?
I would say be brave and just own it. If we sit around waiting for the right person with the right lived experience to talk to those other people with the right lived experience, some people also make the argument that if that is your experience, you're going to bring your own experience and your own bias within that research. So yeah, research methods are research methods. So it's about, I guess, looking at it's about who you are researching. So I would say, even if you are a researcher and you don't have any experience of the community or the group that you're working with, that's okay, as long as you recognise that they are probably more of an expert on it than you are. You might well have read 20 books, 50 books, 100 books. Doesn't mean that you've got any more experience than wee Bob sitting in the corner who's had real life. So I think it's more about making sure that those authentic voices are there. But I always say it's about designing research with those groups as well, rather than inflicting it upon them. I've certainly found that engaging my young people in how we deliver the research, what would work. Like, I am a woman in her 40s. Yes, I'm an LGBT person, but I have no clue what it is like to be an LGBT young person in 2022. I can sit there with my professional hat on or my parent hat on and have some understanding of what it's like, but I don't really know what it feels like to be an LGBT young person in this day and age. That was the 90s was my era, that was my teenage years, a long time ago. So I certainly would never say I'm an expert or more of an expert. So I've worked with my young people to shape what kind of research methods would work. And I think that works really well because I bring the expertise of as a researcher, as a community development worker, of how might this work and who's going to use that information and how would they want it presented. But we also haven't made those assumptions. We have engaged with professionals to say, what would you want answered in this research? How would you like that information? What would be useful for you in your practice to know? So we have involved not just the people who are being researched, but actually the people who the research is for, and asking them what they need. And I think we haven't finished the research yet. We're still pulling it together, so I can't really speak for whether that is more impactful or has worked better, but it certainly feels better. And like I said, yeah, don't get too hung up on am I the right person for the job? It's more important that the people involved in designing the research and delivering that research have the experience, and your job is to facilitate that. So I'm a big advocate for more research within community development and community settings, that grassroots approach. Action research being, I'm probably the biggest champion of get people involved in shaping the research and analysing the research and understanding it and in creating the solutions to respond to whatever those findings are. And that's certainly the model that we employ. So I would, recommend that. And if you're feeling, the other thing is, even if you have got those feelings of maybe I'm not the best person, and if you don't know enough to facilitate those conversations and unpick, you could bring in other experts, work in partnership with an LGBT organisation, engage with professionals who do have the know-how and work together to do it, rather than getting all worried that I've got to do it all myself and I don't have a clue. It's totally fine to ask for it.
Brilliant. Great. I think we've covered everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It's so good to hear it all in the one place, and there's just so much that can be done, and so much experience to draw from in order to do that. And it's clear from speaking to you that it's possible.
Yeah,
there's ways to do that. So just really appreciate you chatting to us. It's been
Thank you very much for having me along.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion with Janice Stevenson of LGBT Youth Scotland. Just a reminder that everything discussed were the views of Janice, Pedro and Gareth, and not necessarily the views of Cash, Hoss or LGBT Youth Scotland. We really want to seek people's views from their experiences and perspectives, and to get more people talking about these issues and speak across policy, practice and research. If you have anything you'd like to add to this conversation, or you have your own perspectives, we'd love to hear from you. So please get in touch with Pedro at housingoptionsscotland.org.uk.